good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Nora Wang Esram, ACEEE's Senior Director for Research, and I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion. We will have four fantastic speakers today: Dr. Mike Spishon from ACEEE, Mohit Chabra from NRDC, Rob Gregg from Con Edison, and Christoph Frank from Center for Energy and Environment in Minnesota. You can see we get almost a whole country covered. Well, while we're having this conversation, ACEEE launched a Climate for Efficiency initiative in the early 2022 to help transform the utility industry. We are very excited to see that 48 utilities have set goals of net zero carbon emission by 2050. However, meeting those goals is not an easy job that requires transforms of utility business models, shifts in how utility have been measuring energy efficiency program, and we need to find new ways for regulators to prioritize approaches that reduce emission. So we're all here to help to have that conversation. Mike will first unpack our new initiative and share some of our early findings. Then we'll invite the other speakers to provide their perspectives from legislative, regulatory, and utility sectors. They will highlight examples of leading states and utilities that are embracing these new models across the country. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mike, our first speaker and ACEEE's Utilities Manager. Mike has been leading research to support policies and practice to maximize the potential of utilizing efficiency to combat climate change. You can read about him on his LinkedIn or our webpage. I just want to highlight one thing, that Mike holds a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University, and he has made a conscious career choice to devote himself to energy policy. So the floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you very much, Nora, and thank you to everyone joining us today. If you're at all like me, you've probably noticed recently that there have been the publication of several reports that have essentially the same takeaway, which is that even if nations live up to their climate pledges, the planet is still likely to warm by more than 2 degrees Celsius, even though the safe limit, I put that in quotes, is around 1.5 degrees. The United States is certainly no exception to this. And this decarbonization challenge is something that we at ACEEE take very seriously. Last year, we announced our new call to action, which calls for us to aggressively scale up energy efficiency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. ACEEE also published a report called Halfway There, which modeled the impact of energy efficiency opportunities and found that they could be expected to cut 2050 US carbon dioxide emissions by about half across a range of categories, as you can see in one of the key figures from that report here on this slide. And if you just look through those categories, you can see that utilities have a lot of influence here and are uniquely positioned to drive decarbonization efforts. And yet, the current reality is that energy efficiency funds are limited and investment decisions are often being used through using frameworks that do not prioritize greenhouse gas reductions. Utility regulators will almost always consider their core mission, keeping the system safe and reliable and keeping costs low. And those regulators have typically viewed things like environmental protection, equity, and economic development as secondary objectives. However, those secondary objectives are rising to the forefront for many reasons. Climate change is threatening grid reliability and resilience, which endangers the health and safety of customers. Many actors, including utilities, are looking for ways to meet net zero commitments and reduce climate risks for vulnerable customers. Cost declines for renewables have changed grid dynamics, putting a premium on demand flexibility and unlocking electrification of buildings and transportation as core climate solutions. Energy efficiency investments are being recognized and deployed as a form of economic stimulus, and continued inequality demands that our attention focus not just on decarbonization, but on equitable decarbonization. And yet, the ways in which utility energy efficiency programs are currently structured, the ways they're operated and evaluated, all of these things limit their ability to help achieve the affordable, equitable, clean energy future that we all wish for. So this has motivated us at ACEEE to work on updating a updated model that we call climate forward efficiency. Good question, slide. We define climate forward efforts as those that treat energy efficiency as an intentional driver of greenhouse gas reductions, scale to meet the magnitude of the decarbonization goals in policy and utility corporate commitments, leverage energy efficiency as a tool to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change on customers by advancing equity, enhancing resilience, and improving health outcomes. Prioritize energy efficiency investments based on their time, seasonal, and geographic impacts, and enable prioritization of investments across fuels, systems, and sectors, particularly from electrification. So in these ways, climate forward efficiency balances and aligns our needs for net zero emissions with the other benefits customers and communities seek from energy efficiency. So in addition to our own internal research, we conducted in-depth interviews with over 20 organizations with knowledge of this space, and also hosted a series of climate forward efficiency workshops to get feedback on an array of questions, including, do we really need to evolve energy efficiency? And if so, why? Turns out, yes, we do. And the reasons occupy part of a new report published by ACEEE this morning, and which you can access on our website or through this link or QR code right here. So I'd like to start with some of the main reasons why utility energy efficiency programs need to become more climate forward. Since 2018, over 50 US utilities have committed to net zero or carbon-free emissions by 2050. Most have not incorporated those commitments into their integrated resource planning, and even fewer have goals for their energy efficiency programs based on climate commitments. As variable renewable energy resources like wind and solar continue to grow, they also cause the carbon intensity of electricity generation to vary hourly, seasonally, and annually. So to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, efficiency portfolio designers will have to adapt and tailor their offerings to capture savings when the grid's carbon output is highest. The only way to fully decarbonize buildings and transportation is to replace the technologies ultimately powered by fossil fuels with electric technologies and like heat pumps and electric vehicles. Both of these are kind of similar because right now, many of the technologies that can work together to decarbonize are segregated by utility silos, such as energy efficiency and demand flexibility, or electricity and natural gas. But by centering around a climate forward efficiency framework, it allows for whole building solutions that can optimize across categories that historically have not worked very well together. Yeah, and the grid is changing. Renewable energy and electrification are changing some regions from being summer peaking to winter peaking. Extreme weather can freeze infrastructure and limit the availability of natural gas, which you may want as a backup fuel for buildings with heat pumps in particularly cold climates. We've also seen research out of RMI that demonstrates that including energy efficiency as part of clean energy portfolios accelerates the timeline by which they become cost effective by close to a decade. You need an efficiency framework flexible enough to handle all of these interactions and open up multiple solution pathways. The impacts of climate change have been and continue to be disproportionately borne by low income and marginalized communities. And so business as usual decarbonization strategies that focus on technology adoption by early adopters risks reinforcing economic and racial inequities. And getting efficiency to scale requires robust market participation. So utilities can help not just with procurement, but with workforce development, education, and potentially new business arrangements that can provide more reliable support to contractors and aggregators. So those are the needs. Let me just wrap up my remarks by highlighting emerging actions in states and utilities that we consider to be climate forward. So emerging approaches can be categorized into two buckets. Those that redefine the range of offerings that could qualify as energy efficiency, and those that modify how we measure the success of those offerings. On that first point, we see four categories of resources that ought to be eligible for ratepayer funding under a climate forward efficiency framework, but which are not included in many current definitions of energy efficiency. Those include efficient fuel switching, passive demand reduction, demand flexibility programs, and non-energy resources, such as refrigerant savings for GHG abatement, tree planting, and things of that nature. On the metrics of success, in this table, you can see 4 emerging approaches to measure success within a climate forward efficiency framework. So if you wanted to follow in the footsteps of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, you could measure the success of your energy efficiency portfolio based literally on the amount of greenhouse gas it avoids. Alternatively, you could take the tact of Massachusetts or New York and establish what's known as an all-fuel or a fuel-neutral target that counts savings regardless of what fuel it came from. California IOUs in 2024 will begin using something called the total system benefit metric, which I will leave for Mohit to discuss during his remarks. And we're also seeing proxy metrics being used to measure success in ways that don't involve direct measures of energy, power, or emissions, such as measures of what's happening with dealerships and electric vehicles. I also want to note that these metrics are not mutually exclusive and can be combined together within a single metric framework. So Massachusetts, for example, has established multiple goals that need to be met in parallel. So not just an all fuel savings goal, but a resource specific energy, electricity goal on top of that, plus a natural gas goal, a peak savings goal, a greenhouse gas goal, etc. And finally, here's a figure that illustrates just a little bit of the geographic diversity that we are seeing with respect to the climate forward actions that are taking place. I don't expect you to read through all this right now. In fact, I invite you to all to check out the report on the ACEEE website for more details on the markers of progress in states and utilities. And in that report, we also propose 9 principles that could guide the selection of greenhouse gas metrics for energy efficiency purposes. And I'm happy to talk about those during the Q&A, but one high-level takeaway that I'll share is that no single metric will fully satisfy all the principles that we've identified for climate forward efficiency. I'll stop there, Nora, and I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. So please, everybody, put your question in the chat. We'll address them after all of our panelists have spoken. So next, I would like to introduce our next speaker, and Christoph Ring, the president of Center for Energy and Environment in Minnesota. Chris leads a team of more than 160 staff working on a variety of topics: energy technologies and policy research, program development and implementation, retrofit financing, and tool development. And I'd like to congratulate Minnesota for passing the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, or ECO Act. If you don't know what it is, then Chris will present it, and he will also talk about lessons learned from their work in Minnesota and Illinois. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Nora. As Nora said, I'm Chris Dufferin. I'm president of Center for Energy and Environment, and we're a nonprofit based here in Minnesota. We work on research of new technologies. We use that knowledge that we have through our research arm to design programs, implement programs. We do consulting. And all of this work really informs our work in policy. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is our work in particular in policy, which is focused in the state of Minnesota. And I'll touch a little bit on Illinois as well, which we're not involved in, but I'll give you a summary of. One thing people, I think, maybe
Grace,
don't
if I could interrupt, your camera is off.
Oh, no. Okay. It turned off somehow. No, it's not. I'm going to have to stop screen sharing.
I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. We can see you.
Let's see if this, I think it turns off when I go to share, unfortunately.
Got you. No worries then. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. You'll just have to look at my slides. All right. Let me. Okay. So a little bit about Minnesota. Folks may not realize that we're, because if you look at how we vote in presidential elections, you may think we're a blue state. We're not. We're not a blue state or a red state. We're very much purple. We have a divided government and frequently do. In fact, we have the only divided legislature in the country right now. We have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. And this story really begins back in 2015 when it was exactly the opposite. We had a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. And in that year, our House repealed our entire efficiency statute without even holding a hearing. And they did it as an amendment and then passed it on the floor. And so for us at CEE, who've worked on this for a very long time, this was a real wake-up call for us that our coalition was not broad enough around energy efficiency. Sorry, I didn't advance my slide. And we needed to really bring together a lot of different interests, and in particular, more rural interests that have more influence with Republicans. And our biggest critics of efficiency were our rural electric co-ops. And some of the things they were telling us at that time is that energy efficiency didn't do enough in periods of time of low demand, that the system was too bureaucratic, that they were having declining sales, and in large part their declining sales were due to shrinking populations more than efficiency, but they were not as enthusiastic about efficiency because of it. When we talked to our investor-owned utilities, they shared some of these concerns, particularly about the time value of energy savings as they were integrating more and more renewables into their system, and their inability to switch fuels even when it was beneficial to customers and the environment. So environmentalists obviously agreed with that. If they wanted to see a lot more beneficial electrification, and then electrical contractors also like this ability to do more electrification. Low-income advocates, they were more concerned about just funding levels for our efficiency programs.
I think we lost Chris' audio. Chris, can you hear us? Looks like you're on mute now. Looks like he's working on fixing it.
Sorry, folks. I don't know. I guess somehow the slides, if you don't have the app for this, maybe mutes you while you do your slides. I can't really figure out.
Would you like us to share slides if that's easier?
Yeah, that would be great if you could do that. I'll keep going because I want to keep the presentation going.
Sharing slides.
What I'm really going to get to is the crux of the bill, which is the ECO Act is really about getting out of the silos that Mike was talking about. We have siloed efficiency programs, load optimization efforts like our demand response programs, and fuel switching, which was done in more of a kind of cowboy-like fashion, and not really integrated with programs. And so we wanted to integrate these programs, these approaches, in terms of both cost effectiveness, cost recovery, and integrating those goals. And so in short, what the bill does, and you can advance now a few slides to the next one right there, our investor-owned utilities, we increased their goal on the electric side. We allow them to integrate load management if it saves energy. We allow them to do fuel switching, but only if it meets the criteria in the bill, which is it needs to save energy, needs to reduce emissions, it must be cost effective, and it needs to be installed in a way that improves their system load factor. None of that counts towards the goal for efficiency. They still have to meet the goal of efficiency, but it can count above and beyond that goal, so they can achieve greater energy savings and potentially a greater financial incentive. The natural gas utilities have a floor of 1%. They can do efficient fuel switching now. However, they can only switch to electricity. So they can actually install air source heat pumps as they're weatherizing homes, for instance. Our co-ops and munis also have goals, and we were able to maintain those goals, which was a real victory for us. But they're now able to count a lot more fuel switching towards those goals, which is something that they really wanted. So we were able to sort of gather all these interests together in a way that worked for all these parties and didn't force us to compromise too much on any of our principles. On the next slide, you'll see there's also some low-income provisions that really advanced spending in Minnesota, both on the natural gas and electric side, and it allows for more fuel switching for low-income programs. Let me jump to Illinois here because I know now we may be a little short in time, but the CEJA Act, we were not involved in, and I'm just kind of representing the Midwest here today by summarizing this. There's no way to put what's in the CEJA Act on one slide. It's a remarkable bill that is 1,000 pages, and it has, a goal for carbon-free electricity, out into, I believe, 2045 or 2050. It has all sorts of incentives for renewables and EVs, but on the efficiency side of things, it allows utilities to pursue electrification in a way that integrates with their goals. It's capped, so it doesn't count all towards their goals. However, they can do more electrification beyond those goals. It doesn't have the sort of binding requirements of the Minnesota statute where we put some specific criteria around the type of electrification we're looking for. So it's a little bit more open-ended. It significantly increases low-income spending and how much is dedicated to whole building weatherization. It allows for energy stretch codes for communities that want to go above and beyond. And then I think the real innovation of what's happened in Illinois is how much they've put towards equity in the workforce. All of our states who are trying to ramp up our goals are going to have real issues with our workforce, and they've put a lot of money towards training workforce, particularly focused on equity, and that's a real tribute to the coalition that came together to put this bill together. I think just to summarize, both of these bills move forward the idea of what Mike is talking about in his presentation around climate forward efficiency. In Minnesota, the emphasis is a little bit more on electrification and recognizing the time value in order to integrate with more renewables that are coming on the system. Whereas in Illinois, it's a little more focused on electrification along with equity and workforce. So with that, I will wrap up and hopefully be done with my technical issues. Give it back to you, Nora.
Thank you, Chris. Apologize for the technical issues. Looks like it's a part of our life these days anyway. Our third speaker today is Rob Gregg, Energy Efficiency Strategy and Planning Manager from Con Edison. Rob is leading the strategy and planning team at Con Edison, and his team is responsible for developing the long-term energy efficiency program strategy, energy efficiency forecasting, benefit cost analysis, and designing regulatory performance incentives in supporting the clean energy transition. Lots of responsibilities, and good luck, Rob. He will talk about New York's changing policy direction today and share Con Edison's journey with us. Let's welcome Rob.
Thanks so much, Nora, and thank you for putting on this event. This is great. So I'll dive right in. So I think as most or many are aware, New York has really put forward an aggressive climate change policy in its Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act that was signed in 2019. And this really has the sort of kitchen sink of energy goals in order to accelerate this clean energy transition. Everything from emission reductions, driving towards 85% emission reduction by 2050, 100% clean energy by 2040, specific goals for energy storage, offshore wind, solar, energy efficiency, zero emission vehicles, and a huge emphasis on driving benefits towards disadvantaged communities, specifically 40% of benefits of investment going to DACs, as we've been calling them. So this is the backdrop that we've been working within, and this has been signed into law. And so this is something, Con Edison has been very supportive of, and we're committed to helping execute this clean energy transition. So in terms of our specific journey, I'm going to focus on energy efficiency, building electrification, and some of the work we've been doing on sort of integrating that into planning our systems, both electric and gas. In terms of where we've been, I think we've already implemented fuel neutral lifetime energy efficiency metrics. And I would say this was a pretty big paradigm shift in terms of how we focus on particular energy efficiency measures, really pushing towards measures that have longer lives, whether it's building envelope or big pieces of equipment that historically have been harder to incentivize and move customers towards. We now have dedicated budgets and targets for low and moderate income customers and building electrification. And this is part of a 6-year framework we have, which is allocated about $1.5 billion towards energy efficiency for Con Ed only, and then another $227 million for building electrification incentives. So this is a really big first step that we're excited about and puts us on a ramp all the way through 2025. We've also had a non-wire solution framework where we're using energy efficiency and other customer-sided solutions to defer or eliminate traditional electrical infrastructure upgrades. And we've been excited that we've deferred sort of over $1 billion worth of traditional infrastructure through that framework, and continuing to build our portfolio there. That's sort of where we've been. Where we are today, continuing to ramp our low and moderate income energy efficiency programs and building electrification. I mentioned that 6-year framework that sort of allocates $1.7 billion across these efforts over 6 years. That's a huge step forward. We also view it as sort of a down payment of the work that needs to be done in order to execute on these CLCPA goals and the climate goals that New York State has set forth. In addition, we're working a lot more closely with the other utilities in the state to standardize our offerings and coordinate more closely to make them easier for contractors and customers to participate across service territories. In particular, really focused on LMI coordination and coordination where electric and gas utilities overlap in their service territories, and how do we work together to push forward building electrification. And the last major thing that we're focused on right now is developing a non-pipe solution framework. So this is very much analogous to what we've done on the electric side in terms of deferring or eliminating traditional infrastructure, now focused on our gas system. And so what are the opportunities to drive energy efficiency and building electrification in targeted ways to defer or eliminate traditional infrastructure? As we look sort of on or over the horizon, I think there's still many complex and thorny issues that we need to tackle in terms of pushing forward this clean energy transition and doing it in an equitable way. So one of the big things that we're working through right now, we're starting to work through, is how do we integrate this framework of driving benefits towards disadvantaged communities into our efficiency and building electrification portfolios and sort of broader clean energy programs that the company has. We're starting to think about or recognize that the role of gas efficiency and lighting efficiency is likely going to evolve over the next couple of years. And what does that mean for budgets, targets? What does it mean for metrics? And then sort of diving deeper into building electrification, we're in the 2nd year of having a dedicated program for building electrification, and we're learning a lot about the barriers here and starting to see 2 main ones sort of float to the surface of how do we handle service upgrades. There might be buildings that want to electrify, but are running into wiring, adequate wiring behind the meter or the service leading up to the meter of that building. Is it ready to handle the increased electric load due to building electrification? New York State has what we call a make ready incentive framework for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And is there something potentially that we can do on the heating electrification side that's analogous to that? Similarly, when it comes to electrifying low and moderate income buildings, what we know about that customer segment in our service territory is there are a lot of renters, predominantly renters, and there could be adverse effects to LMI tenants based on how a building owner might choose to electrify a building and potentially shift heating bills, which used to be part of their rent, over to the individual tenant. And how do we designing incentive programs? How are we designing affordable housing regulation in a way that really protects these customers while creating a pathway for these buildings to electrify? I think is a super important priority that we need to figure out, and it's going to require a lot of different voices coming to the same table in order to figure it out. I think the last thing that we recognize is this journey of building electrification is going to drive a lot of peak demand. And, right now Con Ed is a summer peaking network. That will eventually shift to becoming a winter peaking network if we, execute on this building electrification journey. And what is the role of energy efficiency in managing peak reduction as we shift from summer to winter, and how are we going to more dynamically manage peak load? So obviously some big important boulders that we need to continue to push up the hill as we figure out this clean energy transition. And I'll say a lot of how we've evolved over the years has been in the backdrop of these earnings adjustment mechanisms. So these are performance incentives that we have, that we negotiate with all of our stakeholders and regulators to really ensure that utility behavior is aligned with the policy objectives, and we have sort of clear marching orders of where we want to overachieve on goals in alignment of state policy objectives. And we think that, we feel like they've worked really well in terms of changing decision making without necessarily changing all of the metrics, the underlying ways in which we report energy efficiency or measure success. So I think that will wrap up my remarks. Nora, I'll hand it back to you, and looking forward to further discussions in the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Rob. We saw good questions flowing into the chat box. Let's that continue. And there's some question about low and moderate income. I think, Rob, you mentioned that. Chris, you did too. So let's keep that conversation maybe after Mohit's presentation. So I'd like to introduce our last speaker today, Mohit Chabra, the Senior Scientist of NRDC's Climate and Clean Energy Program. Mohit has been working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable and clean energy future through his technical analysis and policy guidance. He is based in San Francisco and has primarily focused on California and the Pacific Northwest. I would say those are the birthplaces of many leading energy policies. So today, Mohit will talk about regulatory actions to reorient utility energy efficiency program in California. And please take away, Mohit. You are muted.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for that reminder, Nora. I'm Mohit. I work with NRDC from our San Francisco office, but I'm based in Portland, Oregon. So hello to all Pacific Northwesters that are attending. So once a bill is passed, which usually sets a carbon goal, regulatory action is needed to achieve that carbon goal cost effectively. And what that materially means is that a regulatory agency will ask utilities or itself to develop a central plan, like an integrated resource plan or an IRP with a carbon constraint. So that'll determine how much supply and demand side clean energy resources need to be bought to meet those carbon goals and energy needs. Now, unlike supply side resources, which utilities can go and contract with, distributed resources depend on customer adoption. So to meet climate goals with distributed resources, you need a flexible metric that accurately values their climate contribution and also their energy system contribution. Because let's not forget, these resources also save a lot of other costs and have benefits that are beyond climate, which are important too to run a grid. And in a high renewable grid, the value of saving energy, it varies with time because renewables, they provide cheap carbon-free electricity. So traditional annual energy savings goals generally won't suffice too far in the future because 100 kilowatt hours saved, the value of that really depends on when it is saved. And what we've seen is that energy savings are more valuable when thermal generation is on the margin and or the grid is capacity constrained. By this, I mean, we want to reduce gas plant runtime and we don't want to be in conditions where we're constrained for supply. In California, for the last few years, 2 to 3 years, we've had supply constraints during summer evenings, when the sun's going down, but there's a lot of cooling load and cooling demand. So this is where the total systems benefit metric comes in. The definition is it's the dollar value of total energy system and climate policy benefits. And it's equal to the product of avoided costs multiplied by an energy savings load shape for the lifetime of the distributed resource. And for those mathematically inclined, there's a little formula that shows how this works. And this diagram shows that once you have avoided costs of energy, utility avoided costs, and you have a load shape for the measure, the product gives you the value of the measure. And to show it in a picture, these are the avoided costs, a subset of it for California. And you can see how the value of saving energy and carbon really is in the evenings and in September. And this is something that you need to capture if you're really trying to maximize benefits for climate and for the grid through energy efficiency. So the total systems benefit, it captures all of these different benefits. Imagine it's like a layered cake. And so measures that save electricity during these times between say 7 and 9 on September evenings, they're inherently more valuable. So it differentiates between that kilowatt hour that saves the most for the grid, including carbon, from kilowatt hours that don't. Now to develop it, you need to have sufficiently time varying and updated avoided costs, marginal emissions data. So if I save a unit of energy, how much emissions are correlated with that, a valuation of carbon, which could be a subject of a whole different talk, but you need to assign some value to that carbon that you're saving through energy efficiency. And moreover, all these data should be public and transparent. So not only utilities, but regulators, stakeholders, and program implementers can access it to understand where the real value for saving energy is on the grid and for climate. Some other advantage of this metric is it puts focus on measures, like I said, that provide the most value. And there's a table I like to show that I don't have today where I show different measures that have the same exact annual energy savings, lifetime energy savings, but very different total system benefits because some measures save energy and carbon at the right time and some don't save carbon much at all. All distributed resources, demand response, electrification, can be valued through the TSB. So what we're seeing now in California is a TSB goal can be set, and then utilities and program administrators and implementers have the freedom to figure out the best combination of efficiency, demand response, and electrification to go meet that goal. So it helps do the most efficient thing first for carbon and grid needs, and thereby breaking silos between efficiency, DR, and electrification. And the same equipment can do all three generally. On electrification, there are a couple of things I'd like to note. So when you think about electrification, as my previous presenter pointed out, you also need to think about affordability, that when we electrify something, we lower bills for customers. So for that, electric rates need to encourage electrification affordably. And this sometimes is in conflict with traditional efficiency, where higher volumetric charges encourage conservation efficiency. But higher volumetric charges could discourage electrification. So what's the right balance? We want to use more electricity when it's abundant, cheap, and clean, and less when it's not. So this is something that will become a focus as we think of integrating electrification into our goals. The PUC adopted this metric through a recent decision. This is part of a larger decision that better aligned energy efficiency portfolios with policy goals. This also has a set aside budget for equity programs, market transformation programs. And this is in addition to low income specific programs that California does. And now I think in California, more money is being spent on low income and equity programs than these traditional resource programs. So that's it for me. That's my email address if you have questions. The paper that I wrote that informed this metric and recent EE portfolio changes are available here, or you could email me. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Mohit. Now we have all our 4 panelists appearing on our screen, and then we have about 15 minutes to have some discussions. So we certainly have a lot of sophisticated audience today. They're already helping answer some of the questions in the chat box. We really appreciate that. So I will start with maybe a few clarification questions, and then we'll get into maybe questions that are slightly more convoluted. I'll start with Mike. I think there are a couple of questions about, are you aware of any efficiency program looking into embodied carbon, as well as any climate dashboard by states that's kind of conveys where we are in need to reach our net zero? There are 2 questions.
Yeah. The embodied carbon question is an interesting one, and it seems like the next logical step once we get traditional energy efficiency and mitigation kind of aligned with each other. I'm not aware of any. Someone in the chat, maybe, if you are, please feel free to share. It wasn't something that we actively looked for, but I would not be at all surprised if they're not common or if they don't exist at all. But if you look at where development, and I'm going to take a step back for a second. If you look at where development of new construction is going to happen across the globe through the middle of the century, a lot of it is going to be in places right now that are covered in forests along an equatorial band where building codes don't exist. This is a major issue that we're going to have to address globally. I don't know how much it applies to this particular case, but it's a very good question. The second question, Nora, was on a dashboard. Could you remind me what that was again?
Yeah, is there any dashboard or is there any discussion about developing a climate dashboard by state?
Yeah, well, I can say that ACEEE every 3 years publishes a utility energy efficiency scorecard. That project will kick off next year in 2022, probably with an expected publication in 2023. We do anticipate that as part of that project, we will begin to incorporate both equity and climate forward efficiency metrics. So our anticipation is that we will begin to capture and mark progress along the lines that that question suggests.
All right, thanks, Mike. A question for Mohit, and do you use a geographic differentiation for avoided cost on top of the time differentiation you presented? You are muted, Mohit.
Yeah, so there is geographic differentiation, and the differentiation is the question is what granularity? Right now in California, different sections of the avoided costs have different geographic differentiation. So the energy part of the avoided cost is indexed to the energy market. So we have a north zone and a south zone differentiation. The distribution system avoided cost, that's based on the investor-owned utility territory, and so on. So there is geographic differentiation, just not to the level of the substation.
All right, thank you. Since I have you here, another question is, do you have a good list of how many states have developed a social cost of carbon and use that data for cost effectiveness calculation?
So I don't have a good list, but I should point out that there are 2 ways of valuing carbon for cost effectiveness. One is, as the question pointed out correctly, the social cost of carbon, and the other is a marginal cost, or as I like to call it, a policy implied cost. So in California, because we have carbon goals, part of the IRP modeling figures out how much does it cost to meet those goals. And that gets you what that policy implied cost of carbon is. And what that does is it puts demand and supply side resources on a similar footing. So you're valuing demand side resources for their carbon reductions similar to the amount utilities would spend to meet carbon reduction through supply side resources. So there are two different methods. Don't have a complete list, but I think more work needs to be done on this, and maybe I should work on that.
All right, thank you. I think we're all in the early exploration stage, right? Trying something, a lot of good questions from the audience. We don't have an answer, but surely that's the stuff that we're working on together. So on top of Mohit's answer, I would like to turn to Chris and ask, do you think Mohit presented a strategy in California or Pacific Northwest can be applicable in your region? And if not, what's the specific, situation approach in Midwest or Minnesota, just pick a state, you think it will be the first 2 or 3 key solutions to advance the goal?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's elements of what Mohit's model we actually already have integrated into Minnesota, and then there's things we could do more of, and then perhaps things we can't do as easily. So we do 8760 modeling, like we do load shape modeling to in our cost effectiveness tests, or at least we have one utility that has been doing that consistently. And part of what ECO will do is hopefully get more of that once we work out some of these rules. And what that allows them to do, this is Excel Energy, it allows them to calculate their net benefits towards their goal in a way that gives them greater benefit for those hours where energy is more expensive and less where it isn't. And with those net benefits, that's how they calculate their financial incentive. So they are incented to do exactly what Mohit's talking about. We just don't have it set as our goal. Now, maybe the next stage is that our goal should, in fact, be net benefits rather than be a goal of energy savings, and that might be a future goal. The thing that's politically challenging in states like ours, I think, is when you get into things like pricing carbon correctly and carbon constraints. Just mentioning the word carbon at the Capitol has political ramifications. So that's where we're running into some challenges. We think there's some regulatory changes we can make to more properly calculate the cost of carbon than we are right now in Minnesota, because we don't think we're calculating that correctly. So that could be another advancement we could do through the regulatory space.
Yep, thanks, Chris. Any panelists have any comments or follow-up thoughts before we move on to the next topic?
I'll say something. I mean, this just shows the importance of having a strong carbon reduction legislative mandate that then forces valuation of carbon through all utility procurement.
Yep, agreed. Oh, Michael or Rob, any thoughts to share? Oh, that's a no? Okay, so while talking about cost, I think that's a good segue to my next question. We have a few questions actually about cost. I'll start with Rob, because a lot of questions actually asking, ComNet. So I guess they're kind of a group of questions. First is how you get funding really to dedicated budget for low and moderate income programs. I think to be more complicated, and in New York, maybe some neighboring states, you have lots of this like a large buildings on district steam, and those are difficult to electrify, and also a lot of public housing, in that space. And what's ComNet's strategy or thinking to address that issue, like kind of affordability and electrification all mixed together?
So I guess first off, when it comes to funding our programs, our dedicated LMI budgets and targets, that's funded by all customers. And that's sort of a general approach of our energy efficiency programs. This is sort of funded by everybody. I think that's some of where the importance of having dedicated targets is important, because we run cost effectiveness programs, or cost effectiveness tests on our programs, and we show that they're cost beneficial. But I think we also recognize there's a nuance between those that participate and those that don't. And so I think having dedicated targets ensures that you're driving participation for low and moderate income customers, and they're taking advantage of the benefits of these programs. To your point on building electrification and sort of the complexities of our service territory, you're right. We have a lot of larger, older multifamily buildings that have steam distribution systems, steam heat. And that is a lot of where our low and moderate income population lives, and they're often renters. And those are some of the most challenging buildings to electrify. And we don't, I think, I'll be honest, we don't have a solution yet. I think we're going to start by focusing on electrifying hot water, because we have to remember that this whole conversation is heat and hot water. And we need to pilot a lot of different things, both in terms of new technologies that are sort of feasible to retrofit into these buildings. And I think partnering with NYSERDA in New York State, they do a lot of great work piloting new technologies, I think is going to be really key. But also addressing some of these other just sort of implementation barriers. How do we avoid this bill shift to LMI tenants? How do we address the service upgrades? How do we get into buildings that might require a gut renovation in order to do this kind of upgrade, but there's no plan to ever gut renovate that building? So I think there's both a technology issue and a just sort of boots on the ground implementation challenges of how do you actually get this work done, even if the technology exists.
Yep, that's a good answer. And I would like to continue a little bit on that energy and equities. It's a popular topic, and we started talking about how can we advance our energy transformation without leaving the marginalized communities further behind. Some see this as a conflicting goal, right? Putting in a cost constraints. So I'll start with Mike. In your discussion or exploration of this climate forward efficiency with your participants, and what are the main discussion around that topic? What do you see could be the potential approaches?
Yeah, it's crucial, and it's something that we try to integrate into climate forward efficiency as a core value and not as an add-on. I think the first thing always is to make sure that you are engaging communities and stakeholders in planning and decision-making processes. That's not always done. It is hard to engage people where they are, when they're available, and how they're available. Intervenor compensation can help. There's a story out of the Montbello neighborhood in Denver where, in order to understand how to electrify transportation, there are large community conversations with people, like where they'll give them $50 gift cards afterwards to show them we value your time and your input, and it will guide the decisions we're making. You're coming along with us, not along for the ride. We already heard Rob mention a little bit about equity accountability standards. You can do that through setting a minimum level of investment or a minimum amount of benefits that have to be conveyed to disadvantaged or low-income communities. I know that at least 8 state governments have passed legislation that directly instructs utilities to consider or adopt equity goals. And then in pursuit of that, you have to make sure that you're collecting the right data. We have a Leading with Equity initiative at ACEEE that is working towards identifying what those criteria and metrics of success should be. But you also could use tools like California's Cal Enviro Screen, which does a good job of identifying for people what are disadvantaged communities and where do they exist, and then reward it, right? Like, regulators can tie utility compensation to performance on equity metrics. Like, a portion of Michigan's energy efficiency shareholder incentive is tied to lifetime low-income energy efficiency savings. So those are just a few ideas.
Thanks, Mike. A lot of tools in our toolbox, a matter of exercising them. So maybe I will, turn that question to Chris. And how does the Midwest approach the equity issue? Anything that Mike mentioned has been done or it's being planned or discussed?
Yeah, I agree actually with everything Mike is saying. I think some of it, just on the ground, kind of coming from the Midwest, some of the things I think are important are a real focus on building shell efficiency, where it's pretty cold here in Minnesota, and electrification is not going to always be beneficial for lower income customers. which is, really the point that Robert's making. I mean, the rates are much higher for electricity. Fuel switching from natural gas is not always going to be cost effective. And it's likely that we're going to have natural gas as a backup fuel for quite some time for most properties, maybe not all. And so the other aspect of that, in addition to building shell efficiency, is the work that's being done on workforce. I think I gave a good example of that in Illinois, but we're doing some of that work here in Minnesota too. We're going to be creating a lot more jobs in this space, and it doesn't make sense to continue to do the same old thing we have been doing. Particularly in the trades, what we see is smaller contractors hiring people that they know. And so if you have a very white male workforce, you continue to create a very white male workforce through your networks, particularly family networks. So we're doing an effort right now to actually create a workforce program that's targeted at BIPOC communities to help them get training and get into the energy efficiency trades that's being funded now by Xcel Energy. So that's some of the work that we're doing, but we're going to need to ramp that up, and hopefully with help from federal resources, we can do a lot more too.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, to accomplish goal, we need technologies and people, and those two have to work together. Chris, you mentioned gas efficiency, and this is kind of one of the white elephants in the room, right? The natural gas efficiency. I have to say it's a convoluted question with no straight answer. I don't expect any one of us just say, here, this is what you need to do. I'll turn to Mohit, and hopefully we'll have time to get everybody's input so quickly. If we say in your region, right, if a policymaker wants to tackle this issue, what are the top 2-3 things he or she should consider? At least have the conversation, have the strategy to be developed, and acknowledging that is not a simple solution.
Right. Acknowledging the fact that gas efficiency can sometimes build in gas use for 15 to 20 years is the first important thing. And that brings us to something we can all agree on. There are a lot of no regrets gas efficiency measures, like building shell improvements. So even after you electrify, you still have that building shell improvement going. There are certain really hard to electrify end uses, like industrial end uses. So let's focus gas efficiency money on those least regret solutions while we figure out a transition, because there's no way around it. We'll have to figure out a policy managed transition, but we're here. There are a lot of least regrets things that can do that don't cut against electrification and our climate forward.
Yep, good point. And I will agree with that. And Rob, anything you would like to add on that topic?
No, I think I would just stress Mohit's distinction about not all gas efficiency is created equally. There's efficiency on gas devices, and then there's other efficiency that is either helping those gas devices operate more efficiently, like pipe insulation or controls that don't necessarily lock you into equipment for a long time, but is still driving carbon savings now that is beneficial.
Yep, thank you. So with that, I'm going to close today's webinar, and I'll let Mark has the last word. And thank you for the panelists' amazing presentation and discussion, as well as our audience. And then keep the conversation going, and you know how to find us. I'll let Mike talk about the next steps.
Thanks. Yeah, so what is next? For those of you who'd like to keep up to date on climate forward efficiency work, I will encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter at bit.ly/newslettercfe, or you can look for the sign up through our website, aceeee.org. Comes out approximately every 2 months. It's a great way to stay informed about workshops, webinars, surveys, and other events. And we'll also highlight actions and resources from around the country that we're encountering. Our second report in this Climate Forward Efficiency series is the Roadmap for Climate Forward Efficiency. It's going to contain strategies and options that stakeholders can take to advance climate forward efficiency in their jurisdictions. And we'll have a launch event associated with the release of that report, so be on the lookout for that. And these two reports are intended to serve as the foundation for a larger slate of work. So if you're interested in sponsoring any of it, please contact Charlie Heron on ACEEE's development team, and he will be happy to tell you about opportunities to join our Climate Forward Efficiency Advisory Board. Finally, here's a list of some upcoming conferences just to plug some ACEEE stuff. We got the Hot Water Forum, Energy Efficiency Finance Forum, and of course, the inevitable summer study for energy efficiency in buildings in person this year. And so with that, on behalf of Nora, Chris, Rob, Mohit, and the rest of us here at ACEEE, thank you very much for checking in with us this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.